Good afternoon. Welcome to National Gallery Singapore. My name is Lucas, and I work in the curatorial programs team here at the museum. So today's program is organized in conjunction with the exhibition Kim Lim, The Space Between. It is the largest retrospective ever of Singapore-born British sculptor and printmaker Kim Lim. It's a beautiful show that allows us to trace the evolution of her practice for over 4 decades. If you've seen it, go see it again. So here to speak in today's program on more on Kim Lim's practice and how it's evolved over time is Dr. Wenny Teo, a Singapore art historian based in London. I'm very much looking forward to the presentation, which will be followed by a discussion and Q&A. So I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator, Dr. Adele Tan, before she comes up to introduce our speaker more fully. Adele Tan received her PhD in art history from the Courtauld Institute of Art, University of London, and is currently senior curator and assistant director, curatorial programs at the gallery. Her research focuses on modern and contemporary art in Southeast Asia and China. Exhibitions she has curated or co-curated include Kim Lim, of course, and Awakenings, Art and Society in Asia, 1960s to 1990s, which was a multi-year collaboration with the Japan Foundation, Museum of Modern Art Tokyo, and the Museum of Modern and Contemporary Art in Seoul. She has also curated 2 annual Ng Teng Fong Roof Garden commissions, Untitled by Shubha Gupta in 2023, and Sea State 9, Proclamation Garden by Charles Lim in 2019. As well as also Outbound, a series of large-scale site-specific art commissions at the gallery. So join me in welcoming Adele to the rostrum.
Thank you, Lucas. Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see some familiar faces in the audience. I'm delighted to be introducing our speaker for today, Dr. Wenny Teo, who's also a dear friend of mine. She is senior lecturer in modern and contemporary art at the Courtauld Institute of Art, University of London, and convener of the Asymmetry Art Foundation program in contemporary Chinese and Sinophone art. Originally from Singapore, she received a PhD in art history from the University College London and worked as a curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Shanghai and Tate Modern. She is currently working on 2 research projects, a study of the geopolitics and poetics of infrastructure in Chinese and Sinophone art along the New Silk Road, and a book project titled Disorienting Abstraction, focused on the work of 3 Chinese heritage artists who lived and worked in Britain in the second half of the 20th century, namely Kim Lim, Li Yuanxia, and Richard Shou Lin. She's also on the editorial boards of Oxford Art Journal, the Journal of Art Historiography, and the Journal of Contemporary Chinese Art, and is also on the artistic and research advisory boards of Asymmetry Art Foundation, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and ESEA Contemporary, which I've looked up means East and Southeast Asia, and in my time, formerly the Chinese Art Centre in Manchester. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Wenny Teo to stage, and I look forward to our conversation after your lecture. Wenny, please.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming today on a Saturday afternoon, no less. At least I believe it's a Saturday. I have a bit of jet lag. Just give me 1 minute. Okay. So I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak today on the occasion of Kim Lim's long-awaited retrospective in her home country, which also happens to be mine, and it's always great to be home. So the title of this exhibition, The Space Between, takes its cue from what the curators identify as a fundamental aspect of Kim Lim's practice. As they note, it is Lim's preoccupation with the workings of space, physically and conceptually, emerges from her syncretic position between nationalities, identities, and environments. This resonates with a number of postcolonial theorizations, most famously perhaps Homi Bhabha's notion of of the third space as a productive site of cultural hybridity, where fixed identities and binary oppositions dissolve, allowing new meanings to emerge. Yet while this spatial understanding has been central to readings of Lim's work, I want to propose today that we think about her work through the lens of time, or more specifically, space-time. I'm here referring to the Russian literary theorist Mikhail Bakhtin's notion of the chronotope, literally space-time. In his 1937 essay, Forms of Time and the Chronotope in the Novel, Bakhtin describes the chronotope as the intrinsic connectedness of spatial and temporal relationships that are artistically expressed. I quote him here. Spatial and temporal indicators are fused into one carefully thought out concrete whole. Time, as it were, thickens, takes on flesh, becomes artistically visible. Likewise, space becomes charged and responsive to the movements of time, plot, and history. So Bakhtin's chronotope has proven a productive art historical tool for thinking about how forms recur and travel across space and time. From Branifer's study of the chronicity of abstraction to Huey Copeland and Christoph Thompson's notion of the Afrotrope from 2017. The latter refers to the persistence and transformation of certain visual forms across the African diaspora, moving beyond traditional art historical frameworks of influence or appropriation. They add, Afrotropes do not simply reappear over time. They are about time, its passage and return, its negotiation or reconfiguration. They can emerge and remain latent, transform and deform in response to the specific social, political, and institutional conditions that inform the experience of Black people, as well as a changing historical perception of Blackness. While it is not within the scope of this talk today to discuss resonances between Lim and other Asian artists, Asian diasporic artists working in the UK in the post-war period, which is the subject of my book project, I'm happy to discuss this afterwards, perhaps in the conversation. The chronotope is useful towards thinking, nevertheless, about Lim's changing status within, changing position within art historical narratives, achieving significant recognition in her lifetime, yet subsequently falling through its institutional gaps and the gaps of history. This speaks to how artistic legacies don't follow simple linear trajectories, becoming legible or illegible at different historical moments. It is rather poignant that Lim's work should return to the National Gallery of Singapore, and in this very building that has undergone its own transformation from colonial courthouse to cultural institution. Indeed, it was first opened in 1939, 3 years after Lim's birth. Its Supreme Court regulating colonial life through standardized clock time, that crucial instrument of imperial control and synchronization across the empire. That such a space now hosts Lim's work with its radically different temporal sensibilities that I will discuss, marks a profound shift, even as the architectural traces of empire persist. The history of the building intersects with her biography in interesting ways. It's also worth mentioning Homi Bhabha's other idea in the locational space, which is this idea of the time lag, which I think is quite a useful framework for talking about how Kim's practice is also very disruptive of time. So there's a kind of temporal disjointedness about her place in these chronologies and narratives of art history. So incidentally, Lim's father was a magistrate, I believe. Adele will tell me if I'm wrong. And it is clear that he had quite a bit of influence. So this is an image of Lim in 1954, fresh off the plane from Singapore, with no jet lag, unlike me. So this is an image of her actually at Heathrow Airport. chaperoned, as one did in the day, by the Commissioner General in Southeast Asia, Malcolm MacDonald, the son of a former British Prime Minister, no less. Kim Lim, interesting that she's referred to as Shirley in this little clipping here. But by 1966, she had already made a name for herself as a sculptor, as this other newspaper article suggests. And here she's referred to as Cheng Kim, I think, Cheng Lim. And after 1966, which was a very pivotal moment in her career with her first solo exhibition at the Axiom Gallery, she went on to become the only woman artist to be included in the first Hayward Annual and was subsequently one of 5 women artists on the jury of the 1978 edition, a panel assembled following the lack of women in the first exhibition in 1975. Lim's involvement came under fire due to her association with her husband, William Turnbull, who had been one of the jurors of the 1977 exhibition. And this is a very sort of famous lore about Kim Lim, that in 1988 she decided not to participate in Rashid Areen's history-making seminal exhibition, The Other Story, Afro-Asian Artists in Post-War Britain, again at the Hayward in 1989, explaining in a letter to the curator that she did not want to other herself. She later clarified, "What was important in the end was what I did, not where I came from. Race and gender were givens I work from. Perhaps the work does reflect this, but I did not want to make them an issue." Yet, it is arguably the case that her rediscovery, her more recent rediscovery or reemergence in the UK, more recently has at least been in part motivated by the fact that she is indeed a woman and a person of color. Amidst the recent calls to decolonize art history, Lim has resurfaced, as mentioned, in several exhibitions, along with other figures like Liu Yanxia, as their personal biographies, geographies speak to the entanglements of British Empire, as that generation of last colonials, as Stuart Hall famously called them. So what I want to focus on in this talk is how time and space are intertwined in Lim's sculptural practice, talking about her artistic process as well as her own reflections on time. So the title of this exhibition, again, The Space Between, is taken from an interview that Lim gave in 1996, a year before her untimely death from cancer at the age of 61. "The spaces in between," I quote her now, "are as important as the things themselves, like the spaces between musical notes. Without them, it would be chaos. There are certain things in the physical world that we can't see but are important, like pulse," she said. And this connection to the body is important, I'd argue, as it suggests a kind of time that isn't measured rationally by the clock. And so this allows us to consider the evolution of her practice and process over time. And what I want to suggest really is how not only how Kim Lim regarded, used kind of time as a material in her work and practice, but also to draw attention to how she was very much engaged with discourses and thinking around time in the period in which she was working. So I'm going to be focusing on the 60s and 70s. In the interest of time, just the 60s and 70s. 2 important moments in her career where the shifts in her practice across materials were most pronounced. An important moment in 1979 after her solo exhibition at the Roundhouse Gallery, when she begins to exclusively work with stone, is one of these moments. Oops. So the exhibition in 1979 was a crucial moment because it marked a shift in her work where she began to exclusively carve and work with stone. So as we can see from this document, which is in the archive of Kim Lim, which I've drawn from predominantly in my research, she writes, the exhibition caused her to a sense of estrangement. I quote, standing outside the familiar space gave me a more detached perspective from which to recognize directions and channels to pursue. I became very aware of the pull within myself between the ordered static experience and the dynamic rhythms of more organic forms. How to synthesize these two seemingly opposed elements within a work became the preoccupation and starting point for the stone sculptures, she writes. And it's this sort of opposition between the static and the organic that I want to draw your attention to, and I will return to this sort of dynamic several points throughout this talk. So in thinking about her interest in the space between as a kind of interval coded in time, or an index of times passing, let's say, a pulse and so on, it's useful to refer to Henri Lefebvre's book, Rhythm Analysis, Space, Time and Everyday Life, which was published posthumously in 1992. In it, he proposes rhythm analysis as a way of understanding how different temporal orders, biological, social, urban, cosmic, interact and become perceivable through bodily experience. For Lefebvre, rhythm emerges wherever there is an interaction between space, time, and an expenditure of energy. The rhythms that he identifies, cyclical and linear, biological and social, find material form in Lim's practice as well. Her work makes palpable what he called the interaction between time, space, and energy, as I mentioned, particularly sculptural sequences where repeated forms create visual cadences that unfold through bodily encounter. If, according to Lefebvre, the rhythm analysis uses their body as a metronome, he writes, Lim's sculptures orchestrate a similar kind of embodied temporal awareness in the viewer, and arguably perhaps within the material life of the work itself, where geological time intersects with the immediate rhythms of perception. Different orders of time, from the cosmic to the corporeal, become tangible. This opposition between the static and the organic, as I mentioned, demonstrates, I would suggest, Kim Lim's concern with time, in a way that was very much of her time, as I will shortly explain. First, I want to track back to this earlier moment in 1966, which was also another turning point in her career. In the newspaper clipping on my left, we see an image of the sculpture that I'm about to speak about, one of the largest that Lim created, that I want to focus on now, to draw out these kind of early shades of phenomenological engagement, the stirring of these tensions in her work between the static and the organic and the rhythmic and so on. My interest, Kim Lim said in an interview with Studio International, my interest is to give the experience of more than is there, alluding to an important conceptual reorientation in her practice. While her earlier wooden sculptures had gravitated around problems of edge, mass, density, and volume, by the mid-1960s, Lim had begun to experiment with different materials and scales to evoke more subtle phenomenological effects. To draw out these elusive properties most efficiently, she continued, "It's important for me," I quote her here again, "to make a clear, unfussy statement of form. The form is literally there. There is no illusionism or other trickery in stating it. I want the form to be essential to the effect of more from less, but the form itself must be self-sufficient, sculpturally pertinent, apt." The artist then cited the example of this work that we see in this tiny little image there, Day, made in 1966, as the clearest image of how these formal dynamics play out in her work to date. So what's interesting about this piece is that also 2 copies of it exist, one in Singapore in fact, in the collection of the National Gallery, and one in the UK in the collection of Hepworth Wakefield, which actually held a solo exhibition of Kim Lim's work last year, or maybe it was 2 years ago now, titled Space, Rhythm, and Light. So again, we have this sort of emphasis on the spatial dimension of her practice. So rising to a height of 2.15 meters from a simple disc at the base, the work is comprised of a thick ribbon of sandblasted steel curved at the apex to form a narrow elliptical archway. It is one of Lim's largest sculptures, as well as her most monumental in its arresting frontality. As one moves to view it from the side, however, the entire structure seems to collapse before our eyes into a sliver, fully disclosing the flatness of its industrial make and materiality. Even when seen from the front, there is a sense of lightness and transparency to the work, accentuated by its highly reflective surface. It was one of the earliest pieces Lim made, designed, in fact, for outdoor display. And so the work had first been primed with a layer of zinc for added protection against weathering, and finished with a smooth layer of white enamel yacht paint. As Lim emphasized in a letter to the gallery, the Hepworth Wakefield, discussing its future maintenance, I quote, "The sculpture should look luminous." So depending on its orientation and location, the polished surface of the work becomes a screen for the ambient flux of wider meteorological and seasonal conditions. When sighted in open space and seen in direct sunlight, it appears to glow like a beacon. When placed in a more shaded area, veiled by a patina of arboreal shadows, it almost disappears into the background. And as its title suggests, day also functions as a rudimentary gnomon of sorts, which is the raised part of a sundial that casts a shadow. Not a measure of time, but indexically registering the passage of time by mapping the wider cosmic, diurnal and circadian rotations and rhythms of the earth onto the sculpture's immediate surrounds. In this day marks an important turning point in her sculptural practice, foreshadowing the dynamic interplay of form, light, space, and rhythm that would come to characterize much of her later work in the 1980s. So the Singapore version was in fact commissioned by the architect Lim Soon Tek and displayed on the former MSA building on the roof of Robinson Road, I believe it was. MSA standing for Malayan Singapore Airways. So in that, the building itself is very interesting and has got quite a fascinating history that also ties into the sort of the historical relationship between Malaysia and Singapore and so on. And it's interesting, of course, that was on the roof of this particular building. And the British version, as we can see, was first exhibited here a few months before her first ever solo exhibition at the Axiom Gallery in 1966. So this version of Day was exhibited at Sculpture in the Open Air at Battersea Park, a triennial series of outdoor displays organized by London City Council between 1948 and the mid-1970s, intended to introduce the wider public to modern British sculpture in a leisurely parkland environment. The 1966 edition was the first all-British exhibition that included luminaries such as Barbara Hepworth, Henry Moore, and so on, alongside the so-called new generation of sculptors, such as Philip King, Michael Bolus, William Tucker, Lim's partner William Turnbull, and her former tutor at Central St. Martin's, Anthony Caro. For the curator, Alan Bonus, the selection attested to how, I quote, "We are witnessing in this country, here and now, one of the greatest epochs in the history of art." It's not someone to shy away from hyperbole. So the fact that a Singapore-born woman artist was included in this display of epoch-defining British art, in this most English of settings no less, was a rather remarkable achievement, especially since at the age of just 30, Lim was also one of the youngest participants. On formal grounds, at least, Day was an obvious choice. As Bonus observed in his catalogue essay, one of the defining features of contemporary sculpture of the time was the use of modern technological materials like welded steel to completely rethink the function of space. Nevertheless, it is a piece that sits somewhat awkwardly in Lim's oeuvre. Its smooth, industrially fabricated steel surface is quite unlike the handcrafted, rough-hewn textures of the wood and stone sculptures that precede and follow this period. And although Lim produced other steel sculptures, many of which are in this exhibition, Day stands out among them perhaps for its verticality and its symmetry. What is of interest here is also the very precise terminology that Lim uses to describe the work, the insistence on making a clear statement of form, self-sufficient, literally there, apt, without illusionism or trickery. Her reference to these terms indicates a critical engagement with artistic debates in Britain and America at the time, between artists and critics, those who sought to uphold the modernist tenets of medium specificity, purity, presence, and grace against the literalness, objecthood, and theatricality that was seen to characterize the work of a new generation of minimalist artists. So this is two views of Day, one in the light and one in the shadow. As well as I mentioned earlier, she was quite particular about the appearance of this work, mentioning the need for it to be luminously white. And in the letter here on the Singapore piece, it's requested that the sculpture be always presented in a very pristine condition. And this is very characteristic of Kim Lim, I think, who was quite exacting when it came to her practice. And also, as Adele, and I think Jolene will know very well, also quite exacting when it came to her archival material. So quite a lot of it is typed out. And we find it, even in the kind of language she uses, talk about her work, a strong sense of repetition. The same terms reoccur throughout several different interviews, which I'll come back to talk about. So in this, So Caro is often regarded as a pioneer in the use of steel, and he had no fewer than 3 works included in the exhibition, each representative of the spatial dynamics that Bowness was referring to, highly asymmetrical wielded steel constructions that lay close to the ground, characterized by a fragmented horizontality that was deliberately not monolithic or monumental. Caro's constructions, I quote, invade space in a complicated way, making full visual assimilation of the work difficult. And although Day is simply fabricated from painted steel, its stakes are clearly other. Unlike the volatile geometry of Caro's sculptures, Day is streamlined, rounded, and symmetrical. She would later refer to the sculpture as a single entity that should be perceived all at once, so that the process of walking around it would add to the experience, confirming what the viewer already understood of it. So the work generates a spatial encounter that is quite immediate and expansive, and Lim attributes this to the sense of wonder conferred by archaic structures and monuments she visited on her many travels between Europe and Asia. Standing between the pillars of the Acropolis in Athens, she recalled, gives you such a sensation of space, inside, outside, of place, of magic, of scale. While in Japan, I think this is interesting, she encountered structures that can be open to let nature in, freestanding gates that give you such a specific feeling of entering, although all you have around you is open space. And here it's worth thinking about the Japanese concept of ma, which kind of is another kind of configuration of space and time that is specifically used to kind of address this form of experience. So Day certainly speaks to how this singular form evokes sensations of boundlessness, amplifying the changing environment that surrounds it, casting the immaterial contingencies of space, time and light into sharp relief. So this idea of the clear, unfussy statement of form also suggests how Lim sought out to carve an independent position vis-a-vis artistic conventions of the time, while signaling her awareness and engagement with prevailing art historical discourses and debates. She also had a certain critical distance, and that's another term that comes up quite a lot in her writing, from them, absorbing and adapting various stylistic and perceptual modalities from often contrasting schools of thought, redeploying them on her own terms. It's important to add that she also distinguished her work, was quite careful to distinguish her work from that of her husband, William Turnbull, who she was often sort of rather pejoratively kind of lumped together with. In that earlier article, I showed you the writer of the Scottish Daily Mail profiling Lim and the Battersea Park exhibition dismissively referred to Day as an adipose croquet hoop made by an artist who's married to one of Britain's best-known sculptors. But Lim was very eager to kind of distance herself from Turnbull's work as well, although there is obviously a dialogue between the two, both in terms of their interests, their sculptural form at various times, and I think the literature that they read and shared. In fact, in the same issue where Kim Lim gave this interview to Studio International in 1968, probably one of her most extensive, kind of detailed descriptions of her practice and process, where she talks about form and so on. And a few pages on, we find an article by William Turnbull titled Notes on Sculpture, excerpts from notes, quote, made between 1960 and 1968, were not programming, and I quote, were not programming or a priori dogma, but empirical conclusions from work done. And among the many kind of aphorisms and stuff, he adds the idea that the work must be perceived instantly, not read in time. Sculpture in the round, whether open or closed, I'm quoting him here, like composition in painting, is measurement in time and experience in retrospect. Time as formalism. Time is involved with hope. One is concerned with the absurd. So before I turn to look at how this relates to Lim's own work and method, I want to draw attention to these wider art historical contexts that Turnbull was clearly engaging with here, which I mentioned earlier. The title of the piece, Notes on Sculpture, is a reference to, among several, the American artist Robert Morris's Notes on Sculpture, a 3-part series published in Art Forum between 1966 and 7, in which he writes, only one aspect of the work is immediate, the apprehension, the gestalt. The better new work takes relationships out of the work and makes them a function of space, light, and the viewer's field of vision. It is in some way more reflexive because one's awareness of oneself existing in the same place as the work is stronger than in previous work, as he apprehends the object from various positions and under varying conditions of light and spatial context. So this experience of the art object as it unfolds in time was a subject of heated debate, forming a schism between the new generation of minimalist artists and those that continued to assert art's autonomy and purity. This is the Robert Morris. And in 1966, we also find Robert Smithson's Quasi-Infinities and the Waning of Space, a text in which Smithson grapples with time as both material and concept, challenging conventional notions of temporal progression. So he talks about kind of crystalline time where past, present, and future collapse into a cosmic rupture. And instead of seeing time as a linear flow, he presents it as a series of frozen moments. So this mirrors his broader interest in entropy and geological time, but more specifically, the focuses on time can be understood through the framework of a sort of simultaneous presence of multiple temporal states. So what these discourses suggest has been pointed out by several authors as a kind of concern on one hand with the dematerialization of art, as Lucy Lepard theorized it, a shift from objects into conceptual and process-oriented work, and what Pamela Lee called chronophobia, an obsession with time and its measurement that characterized the periods technological anxieties specifically. So artists will increasingly engage with duration, sequence, temporal experience, rather than stable material form, reflecting broader cultural tensions about time's acceleration and the possibility of control. So we also have practices like Smithson's Spiral Jetty, probably one of the best known land art works that materializes, quite literally, George Kubler's ideas from his very famous book from 1962, The Shape of Time. And Kubler kind of talks about artworks existing in complex temporal sequences rather than linear progression. Smithson's spiral creates what he calls passing time and distant times, geological, prehistoric, and tropic time coexisting in a single structure. And alongside that, we see other parallel developments from different parts of the world. For instance, Richard Long's walks through the landscapes, and the Monoha artists in Japan who are exploring temporary interventions in nature. So these developed somewhat independently, sharing a concern with time's passage, impermanence, and the relationship between human and human gesture and natural processes. So Kim Lim's own engagement and shift towards natural forms and ancient monuments parallels these concerns, yet emerges from her own distinct positions. So she does mention a number of influences throughout her work, kind of going back in time, from someone like Brancusi, the Romanian artist and sculptor, whose reduction of form to essential rhythms deeply influenced her. So this is to suggest that her work, though following its own kind of trajectory, shares with these contemporary artists a sophisticated engagement with questions of duration, rhythm, and temporal experience. And a very telling index of her thoughts, I mean, her very deep thinking around questions of time and the status of the art object and so on, can be found in a few notebooks in her archive, a number of handwritten notes that give an indication of her thoughts around these discourses. For instance, these two handwritten pages, she discusses, she quotes from a book, The De-Definition of Art, by Harold Rosenberg, where he too suggests that art is becoming less about defined objects and more about processes, concepts, and context. This meant that anything could potentially be art, leading to what he saw as both a liberating expansion of artistic possibilities and a crisis of definition. So there are a number of other notes in that I want to kind of cite here. How am I doing for time? Yeah. That again, I think, speak to Lim's, the kind of complexity of Lim's position and the way that time, she was preoccupied with ideas of time and thinking, and suggestive of a kind of, almost a kind of cosmological framework. So one of the interesting documents in the archive is this piece of writing here, where she discusses the idea of the absurd and about time, about contingency. So this is I think, if anyone knows where this actual text is from, please let me know, but I've traced it, I think, quite clearly to the writing of Albert Camus, who obviously, was somebody who used the absurd in his existentialist thinking. And it's interesting to note, and recalling again Kim Lim's famous sort of suggestion that she was female and foreign, it didn't quite bother her, but she also had a kind of detachment from both East and West from which to work from. It's interesting that Camus obviously wrote The Outsider, a book, or The Foreigner as it's sometimes called, which centers on an individual whose emotional detachment from society mirrors Camus' own complex position as a French Algerian. So written from this liminal position, the novel explores the experience of being out of sync with social conventions, society. The notion of the absurd emerges in this existentialist framework from the confrontation between human desire for meaning and the universe's fundamental indifference. Through this lens, contingency, this arbitrary nature of existence, becomes not just a philosophical problem, but a lived condition. And in the myth of Sisyphus, he posits that acknowledging this absurdity, this essential meaninglessness, paradoxically opens up the possibility for authentic existence. This very arbitrariness, once recognized and embraced, becomes the basis of a kind of freedom, even if it is the freedom of Sisyphus eternally rolling, pushing up his boulder. So thinking around these moments and statements in the archive, we come to perhaps a clearer sense of how this shift, as it were, across into carving in stone was formulated by the artist. As if the opposition that she mentions between the static and organic had to be worked through. Rhythm begins to play a very much more prominent role in her thinking, and she writes about how her working processes itself are not so much linear as they are cyclical. And I think Hamad Nasser points out that actually her practice in stone very much mirrors or returns to the themes that she explored in her earlier organic sculptures in wood. So stone, of course, carries its own temporal density, geological time compressed into material form, while the act of carving introduces another kind of time altogether. Her precise incisions create what we might call a kind of temporal dialogue between this deep time of geological formation and the immediate time of sculptural gesture. They are not simply marks on stone, but interventions into time itself, where each cut negotiates between this material history and action. So Kim Lim also, a lot of her carvings on these kind of flutings and delicate markings mimicked natural processes of erosion, the gradual eating away of something over time, something as solid as stone by rain, wind, and sand. So what emerges is this kind of temporal poetics where rhythm and repetition meets geological duration. And so these are two early pieces, small-scale pieces that she did because she hand-carved, and called Gobi 1 and Gobi 2. So Gobi 2 is the one on the bottom there, made in 1982. And according to Michael Archer, there is, in fact, a fossilized shell on the top right-hand corner of the piece, which emerged in Kim Lim's process of carving. And Kim Lim refers to how she is very drawn to the shape of shells and so on. But this has not been proven. Have you found it? Some of her most interesting works from this period were also designed to be seen in outdoor environments, in the natural landscape, interacting with natural phenomena, for instance. And also there's a kind of turn, again, to mythology. The work on the left, this kind of snaking form is called Naga, which evokes a mythological serpent from Hindu mythology. And we see this kind of recurring forms like spirals and so on, referencing the patterns of shells and stepping stones. And again, this was very much inspired, as it were, perhaps by her interest in her travels and an interest in myth that she mentions in her writing again. And here she's actually engaging with Levi-Strauss's, the anthropologist Levi-Strauss's, structural anthropology, which if any of you have tried to read, is a massive headache. So Kim Lim is quite literally writing down these different definitions. For instance, this tension between synchronic and diachronic time. So really, again, here thinking about different kind of forms and structures of temporality. So there were a number of thinkers in this period in the 60s and 70s as well, including Kubler's The Shape of Time, which Smithson obviously wrote about a great deal. Also from earlier, Roger Caillois's The Writing of Stones, which is a very evocative text that in a way anticipates some of the new materialist thinking now about the kind of ontology of beings and so on, non-living beings. Caillois sees in stones, both of them grapple with how time becomes materially legible, and where Caillois sees in stones natural patterns a kind of primordial writing, time made visible through mineral formation. Kubler proposes artistic forms as markers in temporal sequences of problems and solutions, and they both reject a kind of simple, straightforward linear progression. So finally, this is the last kind of comparison that I'm going to make. Again, once again showing this kind of oscillation or dynamic in her work between two sort of contrasting perspectives or viewpoints. And in this case, these two, that page up there directly addresses approaches to time in art. Quoting from Paul Valéry and none other than Marcel Proust. So while Valéry approaches time through the lens of this intellectual rigor and consciousness and ordered reflection, or what he calls the time of mental constructions, Proust explores time through involuntary memory, sensory experience, embracing time's capacity to collapse and fold in on itself through unexpected encounters with sensation, senses, and memory. So these contrasting approaches, again, to the surfacing of time in memory and forms of intellectual thought is again, I think, something that echoes her some of her earlier statements as well. So just to finish now, I think it's worth mentioning as well that the physical demands of stone carving, that repetitive action of hammer against chisel against stone, inscribes time not only in the material but in the body itself. And again, this is referencing Bryony Fair's idea of chronicity of abstraction, with chronicity referring to chronic illness and so on. So Lim would often mention how this labor marked her own body, whereas the processes of erosion that are present in her work also kind of echo the wear on her joints and on her physical body as well, becoming temporal indexes of this work. So again, we're reminded of Lefebvre's idea of the body as a kind of metronome, where the physical rhythm is a measure of time's passage. And in fact, I think Kim Lim had an operation in 1990 that kind of severely limited her movement in her carving arm. But she continued to carve in stone, including producing some very large-scale pieces, like this piece here, River Run. So Lim found ways to make time matter. Her recent reemergence in art historical discourse, particularly here in this transformed building, colonial building, suggests how artistic legacies themselves follow complex temporal patterns, becoming visible and visible as historical conditions shift. So I want to end with a quote by the postcolonial literary scholar Vilashini Kupan from her essay, Time Maps, A Field Guide to the Decolonial Imaginary, which I think really speaks to Lim's engagement with temporal frames. I quote, "The fluid time of the postcolonial seems to follow in the wake of Eurochronology, that fateful tethering of teleological progress to centrifugal modernity. This hallucinatory form images time, shot forward and space radiated outwards, both departing from some mystical continental scale Greenwich. Mean time, indeed. And to what reverse this order does time mean? To mean time, to designate time, entails mapping time, tracing forward lines and coming back around curves, creeping links and perforating breaks, the eddies and the swells, the valleys in the shape of time." So she refers to this as these processes and that kind of elasticity as soft time, a terrain in which affect and history are set in motion. And I think that kind of reflects Kim Lim's process, and I think it's a good place to end. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Wenny. This was a really scintillating presentation. And thank you for also setting Kim Lim in the context of her art world peers, ideas, and debates of the time. And also, I think on reflection, that I and my co-curator may have, taken Kim Lim too much at her word in terms of order. We might have tried to introduce another sense of entropy in the exhibition setup if we had the opportunity to. I have lots of things buzzing in my mind, but I also really thank you for introducing this element of time and temporality. I think perhaps in terms of this exhibition, we are much more kind of fixed on, form and shape and space. Time perhaps doesn't really get too much of a look in. And also, I think you've really helped us to introduce a very critical sense of the contrasts and conundrums that are actually present in her practice, where everything is actually not so completely ordered and schematized. There is space to kind of break that apart. And something that I've been trying to also grapple with, because she does, do quite a lot of referencing to archaic mythologies, architecture. And so the question of how to treat history in her practice and artworks, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to that. Yes.
Well, do you mean her sort of reflections on history itself?
Yeah, or even as a scholar, as a curator, how would one, begin to talk about, the presence of history? Yeah, even as one tries to historicize her practice right now.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the exhibition does a brilliant job of that. You've covered 40 years of her work, and the very notion of the retrospective literally means to look back through the lens of time. Retrospectare from Latin, and it's always a challenge because the retrospective is a kind of particular beast, isn't it, where you're kind of dealing with chronology, you're dealing with biography, and you've got to kind of frame and situate the artist within an art historical genealogy, right, or kind of chronicle. I think the question of history and the work of an art historian is it's kind of embedded into the entire thinking around art objects and practice. But I think it can be interesting to look into the archival side of things, I suppose, And like you, I work a lot with contemporary living artists, which presents its own set of challenges, obviously. But in this case, the archive is really the only sort of trace of what remains of the artist, right? Especially since there's a little bit of a tension with Kim Lim, who very adamantly stated, I don't want to be othered. I don't want to be, my work to be read as me being a foreign, a female, and so on. And also part of this kind of concern with biography in the work of non-Western artists, where all becomes, Corbina Mercer writes about that quite a lot. But to the question of history, it's also interesting that I think Kim Lim also translated some texts into French on Chinese landscape. I think it was another aspect that she was working on, but it's not clear to me if, I think it seemed that she was doing it as a favor to somebody who had asked her to do it. But that at least suggests that she would have read quite carefully this particular text that kind of postulates a sort of Taoist aesthetic sense. But I don't know if you came across that sort of translation. So despite the fact that, as you know very well, Kim Lim is quite rigorous in her archive, and she typed out a lot of things, and then you find never dated them, but there's a kind of repetition in the language and the words, and it can be quite unyielding, I think. And yet every return to the archive yields something interesting and different, I suppose. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but.
Yeah, it's given me a head start, I guess, or us a head start. I'm also kind of glad you brought up the word other. I've been pondering about this quite a bit as well, and I've kind of landed on the word, which is a little bit old-fashioned in the scholarly world, difference. Yeah. So I find it a little bit more productive to also think about the difference she introduces each and every time she repeats a certain form, rather than looking at the kind of a self and other modality. Yeah. I wonder if you also kind of sense that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of, she does mention, I think, at some point that visual reality is not the same as verisimilitude. And you're right. This idea of difference through repetition is very interesting in her practice, and also this sort of these variations on a theme or an idea or a form that recur also in her writing and in her the kind of use of specific kind of intervals and things like that as well. But it's clear that she's somebody who thought very, very carefully, I think, about her work and how to even position her work in a lot of ways. But there's also this other thing which I quite struggle with, which is the idea of the kind of cyclical, this sort of things going around, and that sort of cosmos, and there's always a danger of slipping into this kind of universalism, you know what I mean, or a kind of Taoist, even light and dark, that sort of its own sort of dynamic binary, perhaps, which is not straightforward. So in the project that I'm doing as well, it's really great to kind of have these two other artists as well to kind of bounce off one another, and I know it's on the basis of the fact that they were of Chinese heritage, working in post-war Britain, and that coheres them, but also it's really about the differences between them that's very interesting as well, while at the same time there being resonances, very clear formal resonances in their work. Disjuncture, I think, is always more interesting than similarity or repetition in that sense.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up because, you raised the word entropy. And as I was also reflecting on the exhibition that Jolene and myself co-curated, I was also thinking about how do we break apart that kind of obdurateness of the forms and the positioning of them in these very neat temporal chapters. And also because, the references to, I guess, deep historical forms and places. But we are here in the tropics. So this is the place of entropy, right? And so, things will degrade a lot faster. Nature comes in and recuperates things. And especially if you think about some of the sculptures that have been placed outdoors. So there is I think, a work in the exhibition Padma 3, which the surface is also, I think, relay a different kind of temporal existence of the sculpture. And some of the works have also been outside. Yeah. So in terms of also kind of thinking about this other sensations or different sensations of a time, I want to kind of come back to something maybe that is less remarked upon as we think about time. And I want to talk about domestic time, because she also is both wife and mother at the same time. And there is a quote in the exhibition that states, that one needs the tenacity to keep on working, right, to sculpture, as one, would also try to maintain sense of domesticity, or without denying domesticity. I wonder if you can maybe talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's really brilliant that you pointed that out. And I, in the interest of time, I didn't quite manage to bring in that aspect, that kind of the idea of women's work, and that the kind of investment in time that it takes. And also, I think it's mentioned a few times when she had children and that kind of struggle with maintaining, keeping up the work as well as bringing up children, recruiting her children at time. I think in helping her with some of the physicality of the project. And I think, yeah, it's really interesting to think about her, despite her kind of concern about not being othered as a woman or foreigner and so on. You know, that dimension of her work is nevertheless really interesting, especially around the second Hayward exhibition around 77. And also her long-standing female relationships with other artists, I think, is really interesting as well. And there's clearly a kind of dialogue there going on. You know, I don't know if kind of domestic time is as clearly inscribed in her work, but it's really something very interesting to think about. I knew you were going to mention that. Thank you. Yeah, that's a really great question.
Yeah. Well, in the interest of time also, we'd like to open the floor up to questions. And there's a roving microphone at the back there. Yeah. Anyone? Oh, Alex is here. Yes. To the gentleman at the back there.
First of all, thank you very much, Wenny. That was brilliant. There was just a couple of things that I wanted to just kind of clarify. It was just something that when you said about her health and her operation in 1990 restricting her practice, I think one of the things that is very interesting is that actually I don't think that that was so much the case. I mean, that was actually she actually had that operation as a result of she was hit by a post office van in the 70s, which created a lot of the problems. And actually that was the operation that she had was as a result of that. But I think one of the things that was very interesting about Mum was that for the last probably 30 years or so of her life, she wrestled with these extreme physical difficulties that were caused as a result because of this crash. And I think that sort of makes what she did sort of almost all the more impressive in a way. And I think for my brother and I, it's only really in hindsight that we've really been able to appreciate what she did. Because when we were kids, it was just what our parents did. So there was nothing abnormal about even though it wasn't exactly a normal childhood, having two artists in the house. We thought everybody had painted steel girders in the front garden. We thought that was just a normal sort of practice. And I think it's really only, as Johnny sort of pointed out, I think the later stone period was the period when we left home and we would sort of watch her do that stuff. And it's only really now when I come in and I look at those pieces of stone that I kind of marvel at the physical feat involved in doing those things. But I think it is interesting that actually after she had that operation, which was, it was a 50-50% chance that she would sort of, survive without being paralyzed, that she actually embarked on kind of carving the largest sculpture that she ever carved after that. So I think it was amazing that she managed to do what she managed to do in spite of some of the physical sort of stuff. And she never complained, and it was never really an issue with any of what she did. And I mean, the other thing for me that's quite interesting is sort of listening and reading all of this stuff, a lot of which I've never read. And Jolene's been great at sort of quoting stuff back to me that my mum said. But it's interesting that both of my parents the academic side of it never really came up. I think it's interesting that they both sort of wrote these sort of quite sort of thought out, things. But actually it's interesting that at home, in the conversations that came up, it was very much to do with just the process. And I always felt for both of them that it was a sort of very spontaneous, even though sometimes obviously the things had to be planned, that actually there was a very, very spontaneous process attached to the whole thing. And that it's interesting for me reading a lot of this stuff, because I've never read, even though we've spent 20 years going through the archives. I mean, I think part of it is having dealing with two great artists and trying to create, systematic, meaningful archives for their works. It's interesting that it never really came up when we'd talk to them or whenever we'd have dinner, these things were sort of, I guess, very much part of their own theses about their own work, but it's kind of, it's interesting for me because it's quite new for me. A lot of these things, I have never heard them talk about their work in that capacity. But so anyway, look, thank you very much. It's very interesting to sort of, after all this time, to still be learning new stuff. I thought I knew, seen and like learned knew everything about it, but it's great to sort of know that there's a whole bunch of stuff that is still there to be uncovered, and it's great that I'm very grateful to you and Adele and to Jolene for all of the work that you guys have put in to sort of help uncover and bring forth this. And I think, as Brian Wall, who was in the film, that I'm making about my mother, and is in the film Beyond Time and Made, my father, and it was actually Barbara Hepworth's assistant. He said to me recently, he said, "Look, she is one of the greatest artists, of the 20th century. Not just one of the greatest female artists or one of the greatest Asian artists." And it's interesting, that's not me saying that. It's interesting that this guy who was one of Barbara Hepworth's assistants is actually sort of saying that. And he said he was very glad to see that her work was finally being recognized for that. And I think, all of you guys have been an intrinsic part of that. So we're incredibly grateful for you to, helping bring the work to this incredible artist, back to life, because it had ostensibly been lost,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, thank you so much, Alex. It's really great that you're here as well, because I've got so many questions for you. But I think it's interesting because you're I really enjoy speaking to you and Johnny, because you've got this incredibly, obviously you've this sort of personal kind of take on the material, and the practice of archiving is a kind of work of memory, a work of mourning even perhaps for you, and the task of keeping these, kind of preserving these documents, and these are sort of traces of time, right? And then so that future researchers in a way can pick up these fragments that remain and also rethink some of the material or come at it from a different perspective. Which is incredible. I mean, the archive is so well organized. I think the Kim Lim archive right now. Yeah, I know Andrew's my former student, yeah. Yeah, no, it's really fantastic. And it's just really brilliant how involved you've been with this. And it's just great that actually one can ask you, like, how was the whole domesticity thing situation?
Thank you so much for your sharing, Alex. For the uninitiated, that is Alex Turnbull, one of the two sons of the artist Kim Lim. And we have a question from someone in the audience.
Hello. Okay. Yep. Now, I really like Kim Lim's work. The thing is, the process of it is so physical, and my understanding of it is that she never had any assistance. One, is that true? Two, is the carving, is it purely manual carving, or did she use power tools? Because there are a lot of incisions of lines, right? And sanding down to make it really, really smooth. The other thing is the placement of the pieces, because a lot of it's stacking. It's also very physical. Did she do it alone, or did she have help, or did she use some equipment to help do this and to place them in a certain way so that you have that space and light and shadow, because it's the rhythm and the space, right? So these are some of the things that are in my head. Thanks. If you could enlighten me.
I wonder if this is a question for Alex instead.
Well, I'll tell you what.
But
I'll tell you what we've read and what we've read from interviews and things. So I think that there is, that Artist Lives transcript, which is really interesting. It's quite a personal, that
in the British Library.
Yeah, that interview where she talks about her childhood and various things like that. I think it begins with her doing some work in the garden, and she's kind of concerned that there was a tool that was going to make a lot of noise for the neighbors, and she was trying to do it as quickly as possible or something like that. And I'm sure there was some tools being used, but definitely not industrial level things. And I know that column, was it one of the columns, which is kind of stacked objects were it was assembled in that way because there was, as you mentioned, Alex mentions, this physicality to the work. Alex?
No, she absolutely had no assistance. Neither of my parents had any assistance at all. And I think she had a sort of gang tree with a chain, and we would sort of help her move stuff. But I mean, to be perfectly honest, it's not like we moved everything. And that's, I think, again, and actually very interesting. It's interesting that you should ask that, because there's this amazing interview that she did with the British Library that I've actually never listened to, because I was always worried that it would be too emotional. But the guy that I'm making the film with has just listened to it 3 times, and he said that there's an amazing bit exactly about that, why she couldn't have assistance, because actually while she was actually carving the lines, she would actually change direction in the lines. And so actually that was one of the reasons that she couldn't have assistance, because it wasn't like, all right, carve this shape here, I'm going to mark it out. That actually, as she was actually physically carving them, she would actually deviate and go somewhere else. And I only just discovered this yesterday, because we're out here filming. We're actually filming. I'm making a film about my mother, and I've sort of flown my team out here to actually film the exhibition, because I've got to say this is, really it's only with the Hepworth that we had the first institutional show for my mother, which was 6 months ago. But actually this is really the most beautiful exhibition of her work, and it's great credit to Adele and Jolene and Eugene and the National Gallery, what they've done here, because it is sublime. But I think it is very interesting and it is another quite amazing thing, because I know contemporary artists, I won't name names, who do big stone sculptures that are sort of scans of Polaroids sent to Carrera, and the first time they see the sculptures are when they come back from Carrera, and they're made by stonemasons, and they sell them for millions of pounds. But I think that's really one of the beautiful things about Kim's work, and my father's work as well, is that the process, it's not just the end result, it's very much about the process.
I want to point this out because I've seen the maquettes. So it means to say that your mom actually created the maquettes first, right? And with that maquettes, those are models. So it could be commissioned, or she could get assistance to make it out of a bigger stone. The question is, why didn't she? Because if she were to change the lines, she would have changed it in the maquette and not in the physical.
I think it was just really that for that generation, and I mean, look, we told, my brother and I were told, the only thing we couldn't be was artists, because that kind of goes to kind of show how the art world was 40, 50 years, 60 years ago. Really there was no money involved. It was not it was not considered a proper profession. My mother left Singapore, from a good family, because she had to pursue art. I sort of addressed this in my speech at the opening, and for a long time, there was this sort of idea that she had somehow sort of relinquished her Singaporean identity by leaving Singapore, when the reality was she had to leave to pursue the career, because she could never have pursued a career as an artist in the 50s in Singapore. But actually, even in the UK, it was not considered a proper profession. Even into the 80s, you were still kind of considered a dropout. It was like, get a proper job. So it's only really in the last 20 years that art has become this incredible thing, with art fairs where all the DJs and all the models and everyone goes, because they're these big cultural events. But actually, for the early part of my life, like, art was very, particularly in the UK, you had to be sort of careful who you said you liked art too, because you could get into sort of like trouble with people for saying it. So I think that from their point of view, when they grew up, and when they came up, the idea of getting somebody else to make your art was just inconceivable. You would not, all right, you had people like Moore who would make these big monolithic sculptures, who had lots of assistants. But, even my father with his steel sculptures, he learned to weld, and he made all of those sculptures himself. So I think for them, the idea that you would get somebody else to make your sculpture was sort of inconceivable, that you wouldn't be the person that touched and created that work. And I think that's sort of what, in a way, now makes their work sort of more special in a way when you look at it.
So I'm going to tap your memory, because in order to create the space, you need to put placements. You need to experiment with placing the objects, right? And spacing out the intervals. Did she have help from you guys, or she did all herself?
No, a lot of it she did herself, and I think that was, I guess, she's not all of the work were made in maquettes. Some of the works you can see, like Courtauld, there is a maquette and there's a sculpture. Some of the works exist just in maquettes. A lot of the larger sculptures don't have maquettes, but I think that it's interesting that some of the early chess pieces, they exist and they were sort of two sculptures are combined and put on top of each other, but then they end up as two separate sculptures. So I think both my parents had this sort of thing about some of the placement of the work, they would allow the curators the sort of opportunity to experiment. For example, the interval series that you can see displayed, there's 5 or 6 different displays of that. The bridge that's there. There's another version of the bridge that is in another exhibition in Zurich, in Appenzell. And there are 5 or 6 sort of permutations for the way that it can be displayed. So I think, obviously with the stone sculpture, that's displayed as it is. It doesn't get redisplayed. You can't turn it on its side. But I think within some of the sculptures there were permutations for the ways that the works could be created. But I think one of the points my brother always makes is that it is incredible the way that she could create this small maquette and then scale it up so beautifully. And I mean, even when I'm looking at segment, which, as Adele pointed out, they can only sometimes display because it's 540 kilos. So actually, even the load space on the floor. But having carved stone myself, just very basically, and I'm very glad I'm not. We always get asked, "Are you artists?" We're musicians, we're filmmakers, we skateboard, we DJ. That's our contemporary idiom on art. But I'm very glad I'm not a fine artist, and I'm glad I'm not trying to follow in my parents' footsteps. But I think when I look at those works, and particularly in the context of this exhibition, I marvel at the ability to create something so uniform and so perfect, when I sort of understand how the physicality involved in actually making those. And there is actually an interesting story when the spiral work that when he showed earlier on, there's 3 versions, and one of them is a very large one. Each piece is probably 1.5 meters, and she actually worked in this stone yard in Caledonian Road, and they make headstones like for funerals. And, it was like all these kind of big burly guys who were just stonemasons. And there was this sort of little Asian woman in there. And they were all kind of like, what are you doing here? But it was really interesting that by the end of it, they all loved her. She really sort of, gained their respect and managed to sort of hold her own in that space, Well, I mean, normally she worked at home, but I think that one, because the pieces were so large, that actually needed and she would actually kind of rope the guys in to help her move in that instance, because each piece was like sort of 2 meters by 50 centimeters. So each piece was sort of like, half a ton. So, but generally speaking, she worked at home and she had a kind of gantry. And even now, I still have the same questions that you have. It's like, wow, how did she do it? It's pretty incredible.
Thank you. Sorry, I have to call time on this. Anybody else has a question? Eugene?
Thank you, Wenny, for that very stimulating lecture. Actually, I have 2 questions. First one for Wenny. So thanks for speaking about Kim Lim's interest in time. Wonder if you can think of any other British artists that also had this same preoccupation with her, because it's much more evident in the American artists like Smithson and Morris's later work, right? And second question is maybe for Adele as well. What was Kim Lim's relationship to American minimalist artists?
Yeah, I think that's a really fantastic question. I in terms of British artists, you know, there's a much stronger engagement with abstraction, not abstraction in general, but I would say process art and various forms of geometric abstraction and so on. And also, I think Kim Lim was of a particular generation, perhaps, you know, of kind of much more of a post-war generation of artists who study under Caro and were influenced by Hepworth and so on. In terms of the relationship with American art, I get the sense that at least they would have been familiar with some of the publications, perhaps, maybe Alex will correct me, some of the publications that were being circulated around that time, you know, and these kind of discourses are quite extant, I would say. And certainly I would say that from William Turnbull's writing on that sort of manifesto-ish kind of thing that he wrote, it is a kind of response, I think, to these debates at the time. And there's a little bit. Yeah, right, yeah, exactly. So his Turnbull's was called Notes from Sculpture as well, in the same issue of Studio International from 1968, where she talks about Day. So I think there was certainly a kind of engagement with that, and also reading the Harold Rosenberg, the very famous American critic, the de-definition of art. You know, that was all kind of being published in the 60s. And so I think, you know, there was a kind of engagement with the literature and what was going on in the US, at the very least. And so it's not entirely, I think, out of the question that there was at least an intellectual engagement. And tracing those kind of little snippets of quotes and things that she wrote, you know, I think a lot of it actually was very much related to kind of contemporary thinking around the work of art in this particular time as well. And it's quite interesting that instead of kind of going towards steel and dematerial stuff, she kind of doubles down and goes into stone, you know, the most sort of solid and form. But what do you think, Adele?
I think because of the prevalence of, you know, American writing and making of art at this time, I don't think she will be able to go without kind of knowing what's going on in the circuits then. And interestingly, we found in the archive a postcard from Carl Andre to her.
I saw that.
Yes. So, I mean, it's a little bit unfashionable now to talk about Carl Andre in the art world.
And he sent her a picture of his own work, didn't he?
Yes, but also to send his well wishes to Kim. And I guess in some sense, you know, there are material affinities, right? If you think about the, you know, the regularities and the repeated units and the seriality that pervades the 70s work, you know, there are some elective affinities, I guess, between the two artists. Yeah, but
Lucy Lippard as well, she would have
yes, yeah,
from the Hayward exhibition. So yeah, I think there's a critical dialogue going on, I would say.
Yeah, and I also recall Alex telling us the story about at the time where Bill wanted to go to America, and then Kim was reluctant to move over there because that would be a step up in terms of the career ladder for the artists at the time, because that was the much more burgeoning market. But because of, I think, perhaps some experiences of discrimination, perhaps, that might be difficult for the children, she kind of didn't go ahead, or the couple didn't go ahead with the move to America. Yeah.
Yeah, I know minimalism is your thing, Eugene. I mean, I came at it because of the phenomenology stuff more than anything else, you know, the kind of experience, the spectatorial experience and encounter. Yeah, but it's always interesting to think about.
There's a question back there, and then one from Jeffrey.
Thanks very much, Wenny, for your most fascinating talk. And I just want to sort of circle back a little bit to Eugene's question, because I know the work of Nasreen Mohammadi, you know, the Indian. I mean, people do call her an abstract expressionist, but I think there was a significant kind of engagement with time in her line drawings. And I noted that she was also at Central St. Martin's, possibly around the same time. It was in the mid-50s for Nasreen, so I'm not sure how that timeline aligns, the two of them. So sorry, I just wanted to say that. And also I was going to ask about, you know how you've mentioned all these different materials. I was also thinking about the texture of, you did say that day was very luminescent when it was placed in a particular, because that is also got very much to do with time, the notion of the texture of the sculpture. So I was just wondering if you'd considered that. I'm sure you've considered that. Just, you obviously had finite time for your talk, so, can't cover every aspect, I guess.
No, thank you for that. That's a brilliant question. And yeah, now that you mention it, there are so many sort of networks and, overlaps between and encounters, I guess, that the, Kim Lim and William Turnbull would have had with their peers, and through Lim's work with the Hayward exhibition especially, and, these sort of other strands and networks at the time. Even someone like Rashid Areen, I think, was also working quite a lot with, seriality and form and shape and structures at that time as well. So I think there is that kind of engagement. And the more one thinks about it, then the more kind of connections you might find. And about texture, that's a really interesting question, because that's, reflection and refraction are kind of different things, and they kind of affect the experience of the artwork and the play of light and so on as well. So texture is definitely something that one thinks a lot about. And also, not to mention that I only am predominantly focusing on sculpture in this particular topic of time, and I haven't even gotten into the sort of paper and the print and the, all these different kind of materials, which would be really fascinating to look at as well, the etchings and the print works, which I know that in the catalogue essay is really brilliantly discussed and written about. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, labor is a really big topic, as well as
Yeah, female labor and time.
domesticity.
So enough for another lecture,
Exactly.
in fact.
Yes.
Yes, thank you for your question. And Jeffrey?
Hi, thanks, Wenny, for that interesting exposition on Kim Lim's practice. And I suppose this question is posed to both Adele and Wenny. I believe Kim Lim came and exhibited in Singapore a couple of times. I think
1984.
84 Alpha, if I'm not mistaken, was it Alpha Gallery? Did she
And then
exhibit?
the NMAG.
And also, yes, correct, the National Gallery, National Art Museum Gallery. So I was wondering, do you have any kind of, what's the relationship like with local artists, right? Those artists who also exhibited in that, right, in Alpha and other kind of local shows. What's the discourse that took place between them, the exchanges? Do you have kind of any info on that?
It's a often asked question to us, but I don't think we have so much material kind of documenting the exchanges locally between her, and she also showed with William Turnbull at the time in the NMAG show. So it's a little bit hard to immediately say what the legacies are from that exhibition and the exchanges in Singapore. Yeah. I don't know if you found any other evidence.
I haven't come across anything about that specifically, but there's a lot of correspondence actually in like postcards and notes and so on. But I haven't come across any by Singaporean artists or curators even.
Hello, yeah. I met, of course, the curator of, I think, the National Art Museum Gallery show, Choi Wing Yang, and he did mention that he helped to organize that show. So I suppose he's one person that we can certainly talk to. Right?
In the figure of a curator and artist
right,
as well. Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other question? There's one back there.
I have a curious question. I think to some extent has been addressed in the discussion. I'm quite curious about Kim Lim and the notion of Chineseness, because I think, when she is being referring in the news articles and things. I think people tend to emphasize her Chinese heritage. And when I first encountered her works, there are just so many elements also reminds me of Chinese gardens. So I also wonder through your curatorial process and archival materials, is there any mention of how she navigates and perhaps relate to the notion of Chineseness, but perhaps in a more transnational way?
As I mentioned, first of all, I love curious questions. Those are often the best ones. So I think in the archives, actually, there's a kind of, actually, I have a question for Alex, but it's later on. But she kind of did this translation I mentioned from French to, and also mentioning Jean Fremont, I think, is one person who's writing about kind of Chinese things. And I think certainly in the interviews towards the 90s and so on, there's sort of this kind of, she says that, yes, I mean, obviously it is part of my, it would have inevitably affected me and so on. And also she traveled to China and to the Silk Road, and in the archive there are lots of kind of itineraries, and, you know, obviously it was something that kind of really was sparked to interest. And I think she says she loves the Shang bronzes and something, and she just talks about how she was much more interested in the simpler forms, like bronzes and objects like that, before it gets all decorative and elaborate. Alex?
Yeah, so it's very interesting. So, and I think I dealt with this a little bit in the speech, and when I first met with the people here to try to talk about doing a show, there was this idea that she had relinquished her Singaporean identity by leaving. And the reality as diaspora Asians, and I know a lot of people will look at me and go, I didn't even know you were Asian. But for the record, I identify as very Asian. I had a Chinese name as a child, which was in the 60s and 70s in London. Being called Chuan was very, very difficult. So I am fully Asian. My dad didn't have any family, so all of our upbringing was very Chinese. But I think, you know, these are some of the really interesting things about the stories that sometimes they don't fit neatly into what people want to hear about things. But I think that the reality is my mom, when she left, there was a life that was being prescribed for her as an Asian woman, which was as a bride. And she was from a very good family, and so she was lined up. She had a legion of very eligible suitors, very wealthy families, and she had this sort of very, very comfortable, easy life that was lined up for her. And she was just like, no, I'm not. I'm doing this. And I think because her brother was studying in the UK, and I think at that time, as a sort of post-colonial country, the idea of a British education was still sort of deemed to be the ultimate education. And I think she was allowed to go to pursue this to make her the ultimate bride. That was would have been my grandparents. It would have been, look, this is a phase she's going through. She'll grow out of it. We'll let her. She was obviously very, very willful. You know, 17 in 1954 for a Chinese girl from a good family to travel around the world to go to study art is very, very, very unusual. I mean, even up till quite recently, it would probably be quite an unusual thing for a young girl to do here. But I think that inevitably she was probably, there's a bit of, not she was running away from stuff, but there was a thing that she didn't, that this isn't for me. And I think one of the things that Tess Giray, who is one of my mum's best friends, who's a great artist, another sort of female artist who's actually going through a great rediscovery, said in the film that I made, is that actually probably my father, who was a pilot, had grown up in Dundee, was a pilot in the war, whose favourite museum was the British Museum, and is really my father is one of the greatest patinators of bronze. He said he learnt that from going to look at the Chinese bronzes in the British Museum. So Tess actually said that Bill may have helped my mum reconnect with her roots and understand that what she was running away from, that there was a lot in that. And I think it's very interesting that my grandfather, they were moved to Penang during the war. My grandfather was actually the magistrate in charge of Penang when the British fled. and he was left to do the handover to the Japanese. And he had a very difficult relationship with Japanese people because of his experiences during the war. But I think what is very interesting about my mother is that she really embraced Pan-Asian culture. I think it's really one of the really important things. We can talk about minimalism and Americanism, and at the time the world was looking to America, partly to the UK, and to sort of so-called primitive art, even though my father really hated that term because he felt it was very patronizing. But I think what is very, very interesting about Kim Lim, and I think it's only really coming out now, is that she was referencing Asian culture at a time when nobody else was really doing that. Very, very few artists were doing that. And she was doing it in a very quiet, drum beating sort of way. It was just, these are the things that I'm referencing. She was an incredible photographer as well. So actually that's kind of one of the beautiful things, is a lot of the best photographs of my father, of his work, are actually taken by my mother. And actually all of the beautiful, some of the beautiful photos that are shown in the exhibition are her photographs. And you can sort of see how the photographs of the temples, Angkor Wat, and some of the sort of, even just the sort of beams, wooden beams, and I think even things like, I guess, scaffolding here, which was made of bamboo till quite recently. Nobody in the West would have been aware of that, but these repetitive structures would have influenced what she did. So I think it was a time when she was acutely aware of being Chinese, but at the same time, it wasn't something that she wanted to outwardly reference in her work. She was Chinese, the work, and I think now the whole issue of race and diversity has come much more back into art, and I think there is a sort of swing back that was needed. I think the 77 Hayward Annual Show is an interesting example of that, where it's basically a who's who of white male artists, and my mother is the only female and the only artist of color. And actually, as Adele mentioned, my father was on the selection panel, and I think he got quite a lot of blowback from that. But interestingly, the next year they did an all-female show. My mum was on the selection panel, but she was excluded because she'd been in the show the year before, which seems kind of like nonsensical now. But I think it is very interesting that at the time she didn't want to be defined by her gender or her race. But I think, as Eleanor Cripper said in the interview that I made for the film, it is actually a big bit of the story as well and can't be discounted from it. And I think it's only now, sort of retrospectively, that the whole thing sort of comes into context and it sort of makes sense. And it's like, all right, she didn't want, I think both my parents were like, no, we're not. My father was like, I'm not a Scottish artist, I'm not a British artist, I'm an artist. Judge me on my work. And I think my mother was exactly the same. It was like, look, I'm not an Asian artist, I'm not a female artist, I'm not an Asian female, I'm just an artist. Judge me on my work. But I think it's only now that these sort of other narratives can be sort of weaved into this. But I think one of the things that is very interesting is the way that she did manage to weave her cultural heritage into her art in a very sort of subtle way that is only now sort of becoming sort of apparent, and the fact that she was really a pioneer for race and for gender, in a lot of respects, even though at the time that was never really a thing or a question. I think it's only now that these things are coming into context a little bit.
Thank you, Alex. Maybe I would just also like to add that she was also wanting not to define China by the ways and forms that we now know of it. She didn't use, say, motifs from like the Forbidden Palace. It was a very specific period in Chinese history where the forms, or the elegant forms and the very spareness of that kind of spoke to her. And on that note, please allow me a closing question for Wenny. And you mentioned that you're working on a book project called Disorienting Abstraction. I wonder if you can share a little bit more about, how you're placing Kim Lim together with Li Yuanxia and Richard Lin.
Well, it's interesting we're talking about sort of international connections and, you know, those, but it's very hard to even trace connections within London. So these were three Chinese artists of Chinese heritage who were all working in post-war London at the same time, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And all of them were extremely successful, actually. You know, we've got in different sphere, different sides of the art world. So you've got Kim Lim, who's quite establishment, I would say, you know, the Hayward and you know, very well regarded. And then you have Richard Lin Shou-yu, who was represented by Marlborough Gallery, which was the kind of prominent commercial gallery at the time, and the first, and he was representing England in Documenta. I think he was one of the first people of color to represent England that way. And then you've got Liu Yuanqiao, who was obviously with the kind of more experimental signals gallery, David Madala, you know. And so on the surface, I suppose, there's quite an interesting resonance between their work as well, Alex. And I think the question about the Chineseness thing is something that I'm trying to investigate, because it is clear that at the time they were othered, whether they liked it or not. You know, if you read all the reviews, everyone is like, oh, these Oriental sort of, you know, this kind of suggestion, right? And there is a lot of similarity in their formal vocabulary and their treatment of space, I think. And one of the things I find very interesting, I mean, if you look at Kim Lim's prints, for instance, or, you know, they kind of engage with a kind of geometric abstraction, more so than, you know, you've obviously got lots of Chinese artists working in Europe and America at the time, even earlier, but a lot of them are quite like calligraphic and things, you know. You see it probably the most in Liu Yuanqiao's work, who embraced this idea of the point and the infinity and the sort of much more cosmology that's much more Asian. But there's a kind of sparseness to their language, I think, which is super interesting. It's a kind of almost refusal to be too identified as, you know, specifically Asian. And all three of them were extremely successful in their lifetimes as well, and then sort of faded away for a period of time until quite recently. And again, this idea of working with estates and archives is super interesting. So I'm working with Richard Lin's children at the moment, actually, on trying to gather some of this material and to work through, you know, the traces, I suppose, of
A particular way that you're using the word disorienting?
Yes. I think I might call it just disorient abstraction, but you know, they're all working in abstraction, but you know, race is an abstraction, let's say, and I'm really interested as well in the kind of invisibility of Chinese people of Chinese heritage, for instance, in the UK. You know, that's a very historical kind of invisibility where, you know, Chinese people in England are referred to as politically black, for instance, right? So even within that kind of identity politics, the sort of variations of people of color is kind of under erasure. So yeah, I'm interested in examining that, especially in the context of now, where, you know, there's a lot more immigration from East Asian people who face discrimination out of COVID and so on. So it's disorient, I guess, is a way of unhinging what we think of as familiar tropes and expressions of abstraction, the history of abstraction, and also that my suggestion being that these artists are in a process of continual negotiation, you know, sort of playing the system a little bit, trying to be, at some points, be more visible, less visible, but they are certainly, I think, yeah, I mean, their work causes us to rethink some of the presumptions we have around abstract art in that period, I would say, hence disorient.
Thank you so much, Wenny. On that note, please join me in thanking Wenny Teo for today's brilliant lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you.